exam question, Jean-Marc, that you gave me was to look a little bit of the impact on NATO. So let me stick to that, and I'll also stick to the 8 minutes. First of all, I think NATO has had a good crisis thus far. The alliances have shown that all of the structures that were created to fight conflicts, to deter conflicts, to deal with military operations, those structures have proven remarkably useful and resilient at dealing with other problems. Like, for example, NATO has handled cybersecurity, or has handled floods or forest fires in Europe, or even sent a NATO response force to Pakistan to deal with an earthquake back in 2005. And therefore, things like NATO's airlift capability, its consortium of C-17 strategic lift aircraft based in Hungary, its SALIS air consortium, these things have allowed it quickly to identify spare cargo planes which have been sent to China, which have been sent to various allied countries to pick up supplies of respirators, of protective medical clothing, and transport them to other allies. So I think NATO has shown, maybe even better than the EU, that solidarity among allies has worked well during this crisis. I would have liked, as a former NATO public servant, to have seen a greater transatlantic dimension to that assistance, rather than Chinese or Russian supplies arriving in the United States or in places like Italy or Spain. But nonetheless, the military, I think, have shown in this crisis that they are really indispensable. In my country, the British Army has been constructing 6 field hospitals. It's been doing the testing, a lot of the logistics and the planning. Many other NATO countries have also deployed their military to transport patients from one country to another, and so on and so forth. So to some degree, a crisis of this dimension is not just an economic or a health crisis, it also is a security crisis. And I think you could argue that rather than show the non-relevance of military forces, the crisis has shown that military forces are indeed, in a real crisis, the essential adjunct to the civilian power in terms of social resilience. Now, that said, what NATO has to do is not just to have a good medical crisis, it also has to be able to continue, as Lyndon Johnson would have said, to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. And Hal referred to some of the issues that I would briefly mention as well. Clearly, the rest of the world geopolitics, Hal make this clear, doesn't stop because we're all looking inward and we're focusing on our immediate health crisis or economic crisis at home. Indeed, not only does geopolitics continue as normal, but it's even reinforced as countries like China in the South China Sea are cracking down on dissidents in Hong Kong, Iran, with the launch of its military satellite and trying to harass American military ships in the Gulf. Russia flying its Tupolev bomber aircraft close to the United Kingdom over the Baltic and so on. Great powers may be tempted to sort of use what they feel is the diversion of NATO allies at home to push their sort of geopolitical pawns even further out. So I think the test for NATO coming up is to be able to demonstrate its utility in handling something like a pandemic at home, while at the same time not keeping its eye off the geopolitical ball. For example, Afghanistan. We have 14,000 US and NATO troops in Afghanistan. It's a tricky period in the wake of the conclusion, of course, of the agreement between the United States and the Taliban. US forces are being withdrawn, but so far there is no peace process, no ceasefire. 700 civilians have been killed or wounded over the last few weeks. So far, therefore, we may be in a situation where we're pulling the security plug from Afghanistan faster than we're putting in place a political process. So we have to keep an eye on that. Second example is Iraq, where the United States, prior to the crisis, was asking NATO to step up to the plate and take over many of the US training operations for the Iraqi forces, something which NATO has agreed agreed to do. Third example is Africa, where before the crisis, France in particular, but many EU countries were worried by the signs from the Pentagon that the United States was going to withdraw or draw down its rather modest forces in West Africa, but in places like Mali, the Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, where we know that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups are reconstituting, those American assets in terms of special forces, in terms of drones, in terms of intelligence were extremely important indeed. And Hal mentioned, of course, some of the other issues, particularly in the area of looking at NATO's nuclear strategy in the wake of the US abrogation of the INF Treaty and Russia's deployment of the SSC-8 cruise missiles in Kaliningrad and elsewhere. What does NATO do about that? And so on and so forth. Indeed, the crisis has had one big impact on NATO, which is that it has led to the cancellation, or at least the reduction of major exercises like Defender Europe, which should have kicked off in March, which for the first time since the end of the Cold War was going to send about 20 to 30,000 US forces back to Europe to demonstrate that, you know, if push came to shove and there really were a crisis in Europe, the Americans would be able to get there in time, you know, with military mobility, with logistics, with airlift, and so on. And that was an important test for the validity of NATO's new strategy, which is to have a light presence in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, but rely crucially on early warning and reinforcement to prevent any kind of loss of territory. So first conclusion, NATO has to deal with a crisis, but it also has to show that it can keep the eye on the ball elsewhere. Second conclusion, obviously defense spending. Ironically, before the crisis, burden sharing was starting to move in a good direction for the alliance. Trump was starting to make some more favorable noises, like at the London leaders meeting last December when NATO marked its 70th anniversary by, for the first time, acknowledging that the 10 now non-US NATO member states have reached the 2% of GDP on defense spending. That you referred, Jean-Marc, in your introduction to the CIPRI report, which also showed, would you believe it, that one of the largest increases proportionately in defense spending over the last year has come from Germany, the country which, of course, President Trump has been criticizing. And NATO was signaling to the Trump administration that by 2024, which is the target date for this so-called burden sharing initiative, about half of the allies would be on 2% and the others would be moving in the right direction. But of course, all bets are off, Jean-Marc, all bets are off now that we have had this coronavirus, which ironically is going to allow nearly everybody in NATO to hit 2%, simply because the economies and the GDPs are shrinking so quickly. But of course, and Howell also pointed this out, and others too, is going to make it more difficult, of course, for both the United States and Europe to maintain their current military modernization programs. And therefore, how do we redefine that burden sharing debate afterwards? The third issue for NATO concerns China. Before the coronavirus, NATO had done something remarkable, which was to do its first serious geopolitical intelligence analysis as an alliance on China, and basically agree that this was a topic which NATO would keep under review. Over 70 different work strands were started in NATO headquarters to analyze all of the dimensions of China, its economic power, its military power, its technology power, the impact, of course, of China acquiring more innovation and industrial technology in Europe. And of course, in the wake of the coronavirus, this debate about whether a weakened Europe would be even more vulnerable to Chinese investments in critical industry, not just the Huawei 5G debate, will continue. And I imagine that once the crisis is over, given inevitably in security terms, the more negative image that China is going to have in the alliance in general, And you've got to remember, Jean-Marc, that it's not just Republicans, but it's also Democrats in the United States who are tough on China. Any of you who were at the Munich Security Conference and listened to Nancy Pelosi's speech would have found that indistinguishable from what Vice President Pence said on China. So NATO is going to have to somehow keep its eye on two particular geopolitical actors, Russia and China, who of course are not the same. This is absolutely clear, and NATO won't want to lump them together, but there will be certain allies, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, who will continue to want the emphasis to be put on Russia for obvious geographical reasons. There'll be others who will be more alive to what they see as the greater geostrategic, economic, technological challenge from China, and want NATO to be more focused on that. I think this is going to be one of the things to watch. The next thing, of course, is, does NATO become an organization which handles pandemics, and particularly bio threats? I mean, if I were a dictator somewhere, I would have looked with great stupefaction, but also interest, that a virus like coronavirus can incapacitate a US aircraft carrier, can lead to the cancellation of US rotations, of US deployments. Even President Trump the other day was saying that he wanted to prematurely pull all of the US forces out of Afghanistan because they could be contaminated with the virus if they stayed there. But it's not just the US. A Dutch submarine has been recalled to pull. Many European allies have had problems with the coronavirus, which have curtailed military activities and confined troops to barracks, cancelled exercises. Now, I would, if I were a dictator, draw the conclusion that if I wanted to incapacitate NATO, a bug is probably better than a bug missile or any other type of weapon. And again, we now have the problem, which was there already after the Russian chemical attack with the Novichok nerve agent in Salisbury a couple of years ago, of how do we increase our so-called CBRN resistance, particularly to bio threats, and what NATO does in future, given the inevitability of another pandemic, to plan, to organize, to stockpile, to be better able, again, to support the civilian authority in handling this kind of situation. Finally, European strategic autonomy. Again, I'm not arguing that the coronavirus has done anything new for NATO or anything new for geopolitics. I see the virus as an accelerator or an exacerbator of trends that were already there. But as you know well, before the virus, President Macron and others in Europe were beating the drum for greater European self-reliance. The pandemic has only shown that we're going to a more dangerous, tougher, less charitable world out there of international rivalry and competition. The EU High Representative for the Foreign and Common Security Policy, Josep Borrell, has said, Europe has to speak the language of power. And before the virus, the new Commission was looking at, a European Defence Fund and more cooperation among Europeans in their with technology, with defence programs, with their armed forces. The idea being that the EU could stand on its own 2 feet and be able to defend its interests even where the United States was not engaged. And given, of course, the absence of US leadership as we traditionally have known it, not only since the advent of Trump, I think also this goes back to the Obama administration too, the notion that in the neighborhood, in the Middle East, in Africa, the Europeans need to stand on their own 2 feet. This debate will only continue, but we still have NATO. I personally still believe that we need American leadership. I don't see the EU strategic autonomy as substituting for the transatlantic link. So even if Joe Biden is elected and the tone becomes friendlier, the 3 key challenges will still be there. What are those 3 key challenges? Number one, how do we build a common transatlantic sense of purpose in the alliance in dealing with the big issues like Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and everything else? When President Macron, in his famous Economist article, said that NATO was brain dead, what he actually had said was that NATO itself works well as a military organization, but the alliance, the notion of a transatlantic community consulting politically and coming to common positions, was not working. Some of you may know that just before the virus struck, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, appointed a group of experts to look a little bit at the future of NATO in terms of improving political consultation. Going to be very interesting to see what it comes up with. Secondly, how do we deal with the burden sharing issue, which will only become more acute when the problems are all there, but our economic resources to deal with them have dwindled massively as the result of the economic contraction. And then a third issue is that Europe and the United States will disagree. We've always disagreed, although that used to be overshadowed by the glue of the Soviet threat. And we're going to disagree in future on trade, on data privacy, on how to handle China, on a host of issues. But how do we manage to disagree without this being interpreted on both sides of the Atlantic as betrayal, as treachery, as treason? If you're not following me blindly, you're against me, that type of thing. How can we have a more adult kind of relationship where we can manage our differences perhaps more successfully than we've been able to do so over the last 4 years? I don't know if that was 8 minutes. It felt like it, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you again for inviting me on today.